Good afternoon, everyone. I am Emily Bull, DRI's Marketing Director, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. All of our attendees are muted as you enter the webinar. We expect today's session to take up most of the hour that we had scheduled. You can submit questions via the questions tab in the GoToWebinar toolbar. Because we've booked up most of the hour for the session, we will be following up with questions via email after the live session. We'll also be recording the webinar. That recording will be emailed to all of our registrants following the live presentation. We should have that out to you today. Before we get into the session, I did want to make you all aware of our next upcoming webinar. On Thursday, June 23rd, Infor will be hosting a CloudSuite Industrial Advanced Planning and Scheduling session. Infor Solutions consultant Greg Keating will demonstrate the APS capabilities in CloudSuite Industrial. In that session, he will demonstrate how APS differs from traditional manufacturing resource planning, and Greg will also demonstrate the difference between planning and scheduling within CSI. As always, you can learn more, read the full description, and register for that session on decision.com/events. As you all know, today we are also joined by another Infor employee. Marcelo Martins is a senior technical solutions consultant at Infor. Marcelo has kindly offered his time today to discuss the advantages of running CloudSuite Industrial on Amazon Web Services. In this session, Marcelo will review infrastructure, security, and updates in the cloud, extensibility, integration and workflows. And finally, Marcelo is going to close out the session with a quick overview of Infor OS. So Marcelo, you're already sharing your screen. I think we're ready to see what you have to show us. Take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. Like we just said, this is going to be our overview technical demo, and it should last just about an hour. You've already seen our topics for today, so let me just start off with what's essentially an introduction slide to kind of set the mood for today, right? And so if we kind of slice Infor's technology platform and our tech stack into the three different layers that primarily compose of it, you see we have our enterprise applications on top, and then below that is what we're going to focus on today. So we've got two layers of interest. One is the cloud infrastructure, AWS itself, right? And then the one above that is the technology platform, which sits under the ERP, but offers essentially a collection of different services that make up Infor OS, or our enterprise application platform. And so we'll also be taking a look at some of these today as well. But without further ado, let's dive right in, because we only have around an hour today and lots of content to cover. First up, we're going to talk about infrastructure. Oh, and let me mute that so we don't get any annoying pop-ups during the demo. Apologies, guys. Okay, so back to the demo. Let's start off with infrastructure. And so a couple different slides here that we'll go over just to set the pace, because we have a fairly general audience here. One of them is just defining what we're talking about today, and that is the idea of a SaaS infrastructure, right? Software as a service. Short and simple here, the biggest difference from your traditional on-premise or hosted is that everything you see in red is part of and managed by Infor with that subscription, right? And so everything from the networking and the raw storage all the way up to the middleware and of course the applications themselves are managed by Infor as part of your subscription. And that's the biggest difference within SaaS, whereas in on-premise, the customer is primarily in charge of, well, everything in that case. One other thing that I want to quickly dive into is that of when you deliver a SaaS application, there's really two main ways of doing that. One is single tenant and multi-tenant. And so the biggest difference there in this very simplified diagram here is that in a multi-tenant environment, there is a shared layer for all customers. And in our case, that is the application layer. So in layman's terms, it means all of the customers run on the latest and greatest single version of the application of Sightline of CloudSuite Industrial. And then there are, of course, layers that aren't shared, like in this diagram, like the database layer is unique to each customer, right? But so just for clarification's sakes, we are a SaaS multi-tenant cloud environment. We also have a partner, right? And that's the big topic of today, right, is AWS. So, you know, the short story there is that when we made our decision Infor to be and focus on being a cloud-first company, we looked around and it was a pretty short look into who can help us deliver an actual world-class cloud infrastructure. Again, that was AWS at the time, and they're actually still the leader today, according to Gartner. And one more definition slide, if you will, before we kind of dive into the real content here. If you're not familiar with this, AWS or Amazon has a couple different definitions that they have when describing their architecture. One is called a region, and those are just essentially physical locations around the world. And then inside of a region, there are typically what are called availability zones. And those are essentially just think of discrete data centers, so the big data warehouses with all of the different aspects that go into that. So typically within one region, there will be multiple availability zones. And why is that important? Well, now we can finally get into how Infor architects its CloudSuite on AWS. And so this is a little bit of a busy slide. I'm not going to read every single one of these bullet points out. We have it captured for the recording, if nothing else. But there's probably 4 or 5 main points that I do want to kind of surface. One of them is kind of, we'll look at the diagram first and kind of how the layout is. And so as customer traffic comes in, you'll notice that there are 2 different availability zones here, and this is actually a simplification. What that means, though, is that as, you know, from a customer or a user point of view, you know, it's one application, CloudSuite, Sightline that you interact with, but in reality, the back end is spread across 3 different data centers or availability zones. And that will become really important when we talk about high availability. But in layman's terms, you know, that would be the on-premise equivalent of running 3 separate versions of Sightline all simultaneously that are all interconnected and act as one version, and then we could switch over at any time for any reason. So again, we'll dive into that a little bit more, but that's probably the first and biggest part around of what we can do with AWS and how we structure our infrastructure. A couple other big points here. Let's start with, like I mentioned, separate databases for each customer. So even though there is a shared application layer, every customer has their own database. All tenants use servers in all of the AZs simultaneously. So that's essentially what I was just trying to describe earlier, but essentially, you know, your traffic may be routed to any 3 of the live data centers and the farms that we have on the back end. And then last but not least, the subscription, or not last but not least, but second to last, your cloud subscription, that SaaS subscription, does include 2 non-production environments as well. So typically this is turned into by the customers either a test and a dev environment, or, you know, your training sandbox and your staging sandbox, things like that. And so that's just included, so it's worth calling out. And then of course you have your production environment as well, your live environment. And some customers want more than 2 non-production environments, and so that is available as well. You can request more non-production environments if needed. And then last but not least, the last point here is that all of our applications are delivered through common web browsers, aka all of our screens and forms and the applications themselves just run natively in the browser. Everything's HTML5, which means you don't have to download, you know, a local install. There's no Windows client that you need to install. There isn't a Chrome plugin that you have to add before you use the service. And so that makes us device independent in the respect that we don't care if you're using your desktop running Chrome or your laptop, your MacBook running Safari, or you're on a tablet, right, and you're running Edge. As long as you've got a device and a web browser and of course an internet connection, you can access the CloudSuite. So that's the first major slide around our architecture. There's also a secondary one which really focuses in on that high availability functionality I was talking about. So if you're not familiar with the term, the whole point of high availability is what happens when things go wrong, right? And so in this example here, if we look at the diagram first, what happens if we were to lose, worst case scenario, an entire data center, an entire AZ goes down. Let's play the what if game, and let's call it natural disaster. A tornado goes through and that's no longer available. Well, the good news is for Infor customers, you actually most likely won't even notice. You may have to re-log in and re-authenticate, but what would happen is as customer traffic comes in, it's automatically load balanced, like I said, between the 3 different availability zones. In this case, there'd only be 2, so it'd be routed to those remaining 2 availability zones. And then the next part is that the entire stack, if you will, is continuously monitored, and it's also what we call elastic or auto scaling. And so this is where we really kind of dive deep and leverage a lot of the AWS technology. But from a monitoring and performance standpoint, we monitor on down to the minute-to-minute basis almost every aspect of the stack, from the infrastructure health to utilization levels around the application and the database and bandwidth, et cetera. And so there are built-in thresholds for the auto scaling as well. So it's fairly automated at this point, but in this worst case scenario, all that traffic would be now distributed amongst the other 2, and it'd probably be an increased load compared to having 3 available. And so you'd see parts of our architecture start to auto scale out, more web servers, virtualizing, and app servers, pretty much automatically. And so that kind of helps us maintain a level of service and reliability and of the application for our customers. There's also a couple other points here, mainly 2 points on encryption. Of course, everything is encrypted today. When it's going over the internet, we encrypt it with TLS 1.2. When it's sitting in the database, we encrypt it with AES 256. We have fairly low bandwidth requirements, and that's just to say that your connection to the CloudSuite for your active user or your average user isn't going to be a whole lot, right? It's somewhere between 50 and 100 kilobytes of bandwidth needed for you to access CloudSuite Industrial and Sightline in the cloud. A couple other points here, more from the contractual side of things. With a SaaS environment, it's a 99.7 SLA. However, historically, it is much higher than that. I believe on our last enablement call, we are actually, last 6 months, we're 100%, and then so historically, we're actually closer to 99.9%. And then you'll also see that there is some numbers around RPO, which stands for Recovery Point Objective, and RTO, which stands for Recovery Time Objective. So some more numbers you'd find from a contractual standpoint. So our Recovery Point Objective is 1 hour, and our Recovery Time Objective is 12 hours. And then last but not least, even though we are highly available, another part of our architecture is that we have automated backups. It's pretty involved schedule here. We essentially take transaction log backups every 15 minutes, and those eventually roll up into a differential backups every 8 hours, and then those roll up into a full backup weekly. These are all performed online, so nothing gets brought down or anything like that. You don't even notice that they're happening, and automatically right by the Cloud Ops team. So this is just something that happens as part of your subscription. Let's close that one down, and let's move on. So at least at a high level, that's our first section around infrastructure. Let's also dive just momentarily and talk a little bit around security as well. And so the first slide I want to talk about is our shared security model. Essentially, since we have a couple different parties at play, there are different responsibilities assigned to different parties. So mainly, in layman's term, we let each party do what they do best. AWS, being the physical infrastructure provider, will be in charge of their part of the service. Mainly, those big data centers, they're the ones who govern and secure them and make sure everything is up to date. And in terms of, everything's secure, you can't just walk into one of the Amazon data centers. There's backup generators, there's steel cages around all the hard drives, and of course the actual compute and storage itself, right? They make sure all the hard drives are good to go and healthy, etc. From the Infor side, right? Probably very obvious at this point, we have a large responsibility in security of the cloud as well. Mainly from everything from data encryption, right? We're making sure as data goes in and out of the cloud that it's always encrypted, all the way down to firewall configuration, and that we have network traffic protection protocols in place and operating systems are up to date, et cetera, et cetera. Last but not least is the customer. And so there's a small set of responsibility there. Nothing you're probably not already doing today, though, right? The two main parts there are customer data. So one, customers always own their data, whether it's locally on your premises or whether you're running it in the Infor SaaS cloud. It's still your data. You own it, you manage it, and so from that perspective, it's kind of the idea of you're in charge of what's getting put into the ERP, good data in, good data out kind of idea. And the second part is user authorizations, right? And so that's your typical, who am I provisioning? What rights am I giving out? Where can they go, et cetera? That's always and will continue to be part of the customer's responsibility. But let's continue. I don't need to go over data security. Essentially, that hasn't changed in Sightline for a long time. So we still have the same data level security of group and user levels, where we can control where a group or user goes, what screens they go to, and what they can do. We still have row level security in the cloud, where we can segregate information that comes back from the database based on a rule. And we have field level security, things like hiding and making fields read only. All of that is still there and heavily used to govern data security. But I do want to talk about federated security. So this is part of the CloudSuite. It's part of that Infor OS package that I talked about. And its primary job is just to integrate to existing identity providers. So this is the idea that most customers already have an Azure AD, an Okta, a PingOne, there's a long list today of different identity providers, but typically a customer already has that in place. And so we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. That's why our federated security is basically a built-in integration to all of those SAML 2.0 identity providers, so that you can continue to manage and federate users and company passwords and things like that in the same place you're doing it today. And then there's standard protocols that bring that over to the Infor side of the house. And then that enables single sign-on, right? Your users log in once, and now they can drive all around the Infor ecosystem without having to log back in every single time, as well as since we're directly integrating to the identity provider, if you have already in place two-factor or multi-factor authentication, it just comes along for the ride. It would just still be part of the standard process. And then probably most importantly is that this is, almost think of it as a global level, one set of users, roles, attributes that can govern all of our Infor OS. And so we haven't really talked about all the different parts of Infor OS yet, but think about having one set of users and roles to manage all of the different available applications, like document management and the integration and the home pages and the workflows, right? One set to manage that across our Infor OS services. Then last but not least, let's quickly just talk on compliance. So this is a really big subject that I've boiled down to one slide. We could have a security talk just by itself with the security folks in the room. But long story short, right, with Infor CloudSuite Industrial running in the SaaS environment, there are tons of native controls, reports, logs, a lot on the AWS architecture side that can enable companies to meet different compliances, whether it's SOX or PCI, GDPR. There's a whole list of others depending on what you're manufacturing or what you're using the ERP for. As well as, so from more of the infrastructure side, we do have our ISO 27001 certificate for our SaaS offering. And this may apply only to certain customers, but we also undergo the essentially the SOC reports, right, SOC, and we do publish those as well. So that's for certain companies that need to make those available for their security audits in the SaaS version, right, that is handled and made available. The SOC 1 is published biannually and the SOC 2 is annually. And again, and there's bridge letters, and so I'm kind of going into a little bit of deep on that security side of things, but that's all handled for you and published and made available in the SaaS environment. Like I said, large subject though, so if there are anyone that want to investigate a little bit more on the security side of things, the probably the best place to start before actually, scheduling a discussion that we're more than happy to have is trust.infor.com. That's a little preview of it there on the right hand side, and that's a nice little one-page white paper on all the different aspects from the physical to application to all the different policies that we have around security in the cloud. Okay, so do a time check. I think we're right on time. The last subject that I want to talk about under this section is the subject of updates. So how do updates work inside of the SaaS environment? So long story short, it's a monthly release, right? So a little bit different than in the past. No longer do we wait 18 months, 2 years, and have a big new numbered version of the software, right? 8 to 9 to 10. Now it is a single version, right? So we stopped at 10, and on top of that, when we now have monthly releases, so much more quickly, but also a lot smaller, right? We're not reinventing the entire software every month. In fact, on average, and during a normal monthly release, you're going to have somewhere between 2 to 5 enhancements as part of that. Sometimes it can be 0, in all honesty. If we didn't have anything available that month, then we just won't have a release that month. But a little more detail on this. So how does it all work? Well, these enhancements, they are designed, your typical monthly releases are designed to not have an impact on existing business processes or user interfaces. And that's just the fancy way to say that, rarely are we moving things around or substantially changing any processes that would create collisions and things like that. However, right, eventually there are going to be new features that are released, right? This is the idea, especially in the monthly release management style, right? This is how we can get new functionality out to customers more quickly. And so eventually there will be a new feature, typically during the major releases, and that is when we will add a new button to a form or a new way to do something or a new workflow, whatever it may be. So how does that work? Well, the release will still happen, right? So let's take the example here. The February release will happen. And if there was a new feature in that release, uh, essentially the actual window would take place, that new code would be applied, but it's more of a technical upgrade because nothing will change on the front end, right? So if in the February release there was 2 new features, front end features, and you guys came in the next day, you wouldn't see anything, and that's by design, right? So when there are new features, it's actually up to the customer in the SaaS environment to toggle those on when they are ready. So, if we've added a new button to one of the shipping forms that helps with a new process, you actually have to go into the software. There's a new form called feature management, and you will be able to see what new features are available for me to turn on. Typically, customers will do this in their non-production environment first, right? So think of that training or testing sandbox. You'll go there first. You turn it on there. You'll typically go through a cycle of either just enablement, making sure everyone knows how to use the new functionality. Sometimes there's testing or training that you might want to do. And then eventually you'll toggle on that functionality in your production environment as well. Now, all new features do come with a validate by date, or essentially a due date. The reason for that is what we are desperately trying to avoid is what happens in the on-prem world a little bit too often for our liking, is that customers eventually stop taking updates. They're no longer playing APARs, and somehow 6 months go by, a year goes by, 2 years go by, 5 years go by, and now you're out of date, and there's some new challenge that you want to address, but you need to upgrade to do that, and now it's a whole big process. And so that is why there is a validate by date, basically a due date for all of these new features. Now that is typically, the due date is around 6 months for any new feature. Could be longer depending on the size of the feature, but we found 6 months is generally enough time to be able to let our customers go. And again, anywhere inside that 6 months, turn that on in your non-production environment, do any testing or training, and then eventually turn that on in your production environment. Additionally, monthly updates are also designed to not have any impacts on integrations that we set up with the integration platform that we're going to talk about today, extensions, which again, that's going to be our next topic, is all around how we extend in the cloud, and personalizations. Last but not least, upgrades are performed by Infor, so they are part of your subscription. They happen automatically. There is regular release communications, so about a month and a half before you'll get the the release notes, if you will, what's coming up in the July and the June releases and what to expect. And then last but not least, there is a monthly service window. So that's when the actual release or update takes place in the SaaS environment in the cloud. That is the third Saturday of the month at 12:01 a.m. Eastern for approximately 15 minutes. That is when we actually do the update. So that is when parts of the system will be brought down. The update will take place, then we'll bring the system back up. Now, that isn't our goal, though. Our end goal is actually to be at 0 downtime. And so that's what we're working towards. I believe we'll be able to achieve that right before the end of this year, where we actually don't have to bring any parts of the system down. We don't have to log anyone out for 15 minutes or any amount of time in that case, and just do some nice magic on the back end where the next time you log out and the next time you log in, you're just on the next version. Okay, and so that is release management. And that's actually it for the first section. And that's typically the largest section, lots to cover in there. I have this review tab, which I'm essentially going to leave up, and that kind of calls out everything we talked about, kind of the highlights that we wanted to focus on and what we really went into during that section. And so mainly from infrastructure and for security, I wanted to highlight that we have a true multi-tenant cloud SaaS application. Within that, leveraged heavily, with our partnership with AWS, we have robust, high availability and disaster recovery functionality built in. We didn't get to go into security too much, but rich security features, and of course, last but not least, those automated monthly updates. So next up, we're going to talk about the subject of extensibility, and this tends to be another one that is highly, interesting, and a lot of questions normally come up during this section. So let's talk about that. First and foremost, what is extensibility? Well, it's just the opposite of what we call traditional modification or customization. So traditional modification is just the idea that sometimes customers have to go in and they actually change the core code, right? That's this red lines in this first example. We had to change the core code to meet our needs as a business, and we need the software to run like this, which is actually fine by itself. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to do what you have to do. Eventually, though, there's going to be a new update, a new patch, a new feature by the vendor of that software. They're going to make their own core code changes. And in this example, you have to do what I'm calling a manual merge, right? Someone technical has to come in and kind of combine the two together, make sure your custom code doesn't overwrite the new functionality or vice versa. And that is modification, right? That is the kind of the old way of doing things, if you will. It's technical, it is time intensive and labor intensive of someone having to actually physically and manually do this. So what's the opposite of that? Well, it's extensibility, right? That's what the word that I'll be using for the most part, and what we try to follow here at Infor, both for our SaaS environments and on-prem, to be honest with you. The biggest difference here is that we don't touch the core code. We try to leave it as is pretty much all the time. Instead, we'll have extension logic. So this is, your 30,000 foot view of it, but in layman's terms, we're able to separate it. So it's in its own box now, right? We can, with the Mongoose framework and with the underlying technology, we can tell what is core code and versus what is customer extension. So the same idea applies here. There's going to eventually be a new update and a new feature, but now the core code is able to just upgrade as is. There's no direct competition and overriding there, and then the extension logic stays on the side. And that's really all it is at a very high level, right? This is a more complex subject, and we might dive into it a little more as we go through it. But there's two main goals, right? The biggest goal is that we want our customers to take their updates, right? Especially when you're in the SaaS cloud model, you're getting those monthly updates, you're paying for that subscription, so you might as well be able and take those new features as soon as they come out or as soon as you're ready, really. But at the same time, me personally, I've never met a customer that hasn't needed to do some type of extension be it very simple stuff like front end, name changes or things like that, label changes, to much more involved business process changes and coding and all of that, right? And so that's why we also need to provide the ability to extend the software, but ultimately, right, in a upgrade-proof manner, and that's what extensibility is all about. So let's look at where we can extend. And so the good news is that with the Mongoose framework underneath CloudSuite Industrial, underneath Sightline, there's actually quite a lot we can do just right out of the box in terms of extensibility. And this is at every level of the system. So this is kind of divided into 3 layers. If we start at the database layer, even in the SaaS environment, you are allowed and able to add new SQL tables into the database. So think of your customer defined tables that you want to add from scratch. That's okay. Some of you may be familiar with the user extended tables, or the acronym UET. Right? That's where if you want to extend an existing schema from the standard product, I want to go and add a couple columns to the item master, to the orders table, to anything. That's what UETs are for, and they're also supported, right? So if you have any UETs, they'll just come along for the ride, and of course you can make new ones at any time. We even have the ability to, a little bit below that is the idea of an XGen, or when you have standard stored procedure logic out of the box and you want to extend that, you want to add a statement, or you want to add a field to the select statement of that stored procedure, something like that. That's where XGens come in, and they are supported in the cloud as well. If we go a layer above that, we have the application layer, right? And so here we have the data objects, right, for all of our different subjects inside of Sightline. And so those didn't go away by any means. And on top of that, they also are still extendable. So you can make new data objects, relate things in ways, and join tables to your heart's content, as well as you can extend the existing data objects. So I can make an extended version of the vendor's data object, or the items data object. And add, my own column to that, my own calculated field or a sub-collection. We even have custom assemblies. This is really just a fancy word for scripting and coding, right? So you can write, it's a .NET framework, so C# code or Visual Basic, and import that. And so this is kind of the lowest and most technical way to do an extension, but it's, if it is needed, it is available, so it's worth mentioning. There's an event system that is still heavily leveraged and improved upon, especially in the latest version. It's very nice. So the event system is still there, and we're able to basically use that as our way to trigger off of any events and extend as well. So this is often related to workflows, but there's going to be a bunch of events out of the box, and then you can edit those events and or add new events to the system. Often, like I said, these will be how you trigger off different workflows in the system. But it could really be anything from scheduling things to happen at a certain time to piggybacking off of an insert that has just been made into your database, and you want to run some type of script or some type of event at that point. The event system can do that. And then last but not least is the presentation layer, right? And so we still have a form editor. That's the part that I'll actually demo, since the rest of it's kind of a little bit technical to show. But we still have a form editor, and in that case, forms are still able to be extended, as well as you can create brand new forms. There's still form scripting, and then there's a whole reporting engine that is directly inside of the framework now, where you can, of course, edit the existing form reports. That's like your typical printed out, pixel perfect type of reports directly in the system, as well as your more classical data view type of reports, right? That's your column layout or your column row layout Excel type reports. That's also under the reporting engine, so you can make new and extend the data views in the system. And actually, under the latest release, right, there's over 700 out-of-the-box reports today, and so lots of new reports in that respect, and then kind of all of them are extendable, or you can make your own as well. What we'll demo though is the form editor. And so let's actually do that. Let's go into, let's go live into the software. So I've been in my browser this whole time. I've actually just been in my CloudSuite, working off of a home page. But now I'm going to jump into CloudSuite Industrial Sightline, and I'm just opening up my standard vendors form. Nothing fancy here. And we can still go into design mode. So that's this button right here. Again, everything's still security based. So I only am able to do this because I have that assigned role. Otherwise, that's, I believe, hidden or at least grayed out for most users. I still have the ability to select my scope, right? So who do I want this change to affect? I can have it affect everybody, or just a specific group, or just a specific user. I'll just select site default. And then, so this is our same designer from before, except now it's all in the web, so no need to have the Click Once client open to actually be and design everything. Same layout as before. We've got our form in the middle, and we can drag and drop and move things. We've got our toolbox on the left, where if we ever need to add anything to an existing form, we can find it. And of course, we've got our property panels on the right with all of our settings, from appearance to behavior to the data source of different elements to to the events of what happens when things are clicked or data changes and all of that good stuff. And there's also another setting panel down here where we can see some of the stuff, such as the primary collection and an easy way to find any components. Of course, all the event handlers that are on the form and variables, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's that last layer, right? But it's still just as easy to be able to open up forms, move things around, add things to them, or of course create new ones from scratch. And I can just save that and close this, and that takes effect immediately. I just have to reopen that vendor's form though. That's the one step I do have to do. And then the two little minor things I did as an example was move the zip code and add a button that doesn't do anything. Right? But that's that last layer right around presentation. And then let's also talk about really quickly tools and examples. So we do have promotion tools. This is basically the idea of, well, when I make an extension, how do I move them between my environment? The short answer is, well, you just use some of our built-in promotion forms that will help with that. One of them is called deployment, which is a little bit newer, and it's very nice. You just kind of tell it, which form you want to export out, and then you'd select that, and then you could even select include application data, and it will grab everything related to that form. So the form itself, the data object underneath it, and if you do the include application data, the SQL table is below that, and of course all the different metadata like menus and strings and all that kind of stuff that you used to kind of have to grab individually. It grabs it all for you now in one. On top of that, there's still your traditional stuff like form sync. Form sync is now a form right inside the system where you can go in and grab, just like you would before, any forms that you want to move, any changes, that kind of thing, all available to you right just within the system now in the web. And so that's that last part that I wanted to talk about, promotion tools. All user accessible, all very easy to take any extensions you've done and move them between your environments. So that's the subject of extensibility. So again, at a high level, all it really is the idea of upgrade-proof extensions. It does run fairly deep though, right? So deep extensions at every level, meaning we can still extend the database, we can still extend the application and the logic, and we can still extend, of course, the front end and the presentation layer. And Mongoose is still a low-code application development framework. So you don't really too often have to jump into code. That's why there's the different graphical front end, like on the form designer, as well as there's lots of wizards that can help walk you through processes from creating a workflow to designing all sorts of stuff. And then last but not least, there's that user accessible promotion tools as well. So how do we move things? It's fairly easy. You just go and kind of export them right within the system and then import them into the other. Okay, so 20 minutes left, and I've got two subjects, so I think I'm right on time. The next subject I want to talk about is integrations and workflow within the SaaS environment. So this is just kind of the introduction to that. Mainly, all we're saying here is that most enterprises do need an a standard-based integration platform. And so that is exactly what Infor ION is. It is our integration platform that is included with Infor OS, and it handles all sorts of things around the subject of integrating. But let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. Here's kind of a top-level way to view that. You'll have your Infor applications, whether it's just the ERP or you may have more than one, and business data will be pushed out of them either in a scheduled or real-time basis. Typically, this may be XML BODs or single JSON payloads, or of course, there is a full REST API for pretty much all of our applications today, including CloudSuite Industrial Sightline. And so through one of these formats, data will flow through ION. The most obvious use case is to then integrate that to, from our eyes, a non-Infor application. So this may be on-premise applications that you have, or cloud/third-party software that you've purchased and that you need to push and pull data from. And so same kind of thing. Business data will come out of these applications in typically one of these three formats and be replicated and obviously orchestrated through ION. Right? So that's kind of its most obvious and first example of what it does, is integrate your Infor and non-Infor apps all together. And it also does a little bit more than that. There's some other use cases around workflows, which we'll look at, and the data lake as well, which we'll also look at. And the way that it does this is we have all sorts of technology connectors. I won't go into this slide detail by detail, but the short answer there is that we have technology connectors to, we can listen to a shared file or an SFTP site. We can call out to a Java messaging service. We can, of course, call APIs. Both Infor has, REST APIs for all of its products today, as well for most of its products, I should say, as well as we can register any third-party API, right? So, very common ones like Salesforce and really any cloud application has a REST API, and so we would register that, and that's how we would be able to talk to that inside of our ION gateway. And then we can talk to databases as well, and whether they're on-premise, like you hear here on the left-hand side, or they're in the cloud, like over here on the right-hand side. And then I can also, let's actually look at, let's go into the actual application itself. So this is ION, and I just really wanted to quickly show you some live software and kind of get out of the slide deck for just a second. These are all the connection points. So really what I just described, this is where we'll register those different technology connectors, whether we're talking to a database or file or an API, et cetera. Then once we have that registered, we can go and set up a data flow where we can actually orchestrate that data, right? When and where does it move? And it's actually drag and drop on the front end. So it's a bit of a nice system to actually manage and set up as well. So in this very simple example, I've brought down my CSI, specifically my Dallas site, and I'm pushing out customer address master information that's being sent out. In this case, I have a mapping step here. So I'm going to map. It comes out in a JSON format. I'm going to map that to CSV, my typical Excel file. And then I'm going to go and stick that into a shared folder on my local network, right? So I'm basically automatically exporting, in this case, customer address changes into a shared folder, which will then, in this imaginary use case, get picked up and be used elsewhere. And so that's just one example, but this is kind of what that front end actually looks like inside ION, and this is how we design and actually build out these flows. And then, like I mentioned, there's also a full REST API for all of our different applications within the suite, and Sightline is no different. So this is the API part of ION, where it's called the API Gateway, where I can see all of my APIs for my different applications. I'll go into Sightline, and I'll look at the Sightline API. The nice part about this is that all the documentation is right here in the browser. And even better than that, I can also click try it out and test it live right here from the browser. So if I actually filled this out, for time's sake, I don't have enough time, but if I gave it, my site, my IDO, and a couple properties to pull down and hit execute, it would give me a list of whatever kind of data I'm trying to pull out of the system, and give me a really easy way to test that right within the system itself. And then last but not least is, at least on that first section under ION, is also the subject of data fabric. And so apologies, I'm going just a little bit quick at this point because I want to cover everything. So long story short, data fabric is just the idea that there's a lot of different information out there today for most enterprises. We're constantly generating data, obviously inside of the ERP with our edge applications that we may have, and kind of, as we're going into the future, kind of this industry 4.0. IoT is starting to be a big thing, automated sensors and machinery and lots of data that gets generated from all of these different things. So the whole point of our data fabric, which is again part of the OS, everything I've shown so far is just standard. It's all included in the SaaS environment. So for data fabric, the idea is to just capture all of that. We need one single repository, easily, automatically capture every change, every instance of data, and store it in a long-term, immutable, meaning we can't change it after it's stored, fairly scalable solution. And so once we have that all in one place, we can start to do exciting things with it. But that's at the very core what the data fabric is all about. And that's actually what happens out of the box. This is called the data fabric strategy slide, and it just kind of describes how data within the CloudSuite, within the SaaS environment, is accessed, because you can access in different ways. Like there's real-time connections, there's near real-time, and then there's things that are on a schedule. And so, whether you're on a home page or a dashboard, or you're looking up your ad hoc reports, your standard reports, or you're filtering on a form, that's all real-time information directly out of the CloudSuite. Same thing with the API layer. Anything over the API is directly against the application. But what will happen out of the box, to the data fabric point that I was making earlier, is that CloudSuite Industrial Sightline will automatically push all of its data into the data lake in near real time. So basically, as soon as you make a change to the customer orders table, that gets pushed right into the data lake. What was the change? Who did it? And when? And so we have basically an up-to-date copy of our production database, as well as it's fully history tracked. I can go in and ask Data Lake, show me, I don't know, pick a random table, the forecast table or the customer address table, and show me how it's been changed over time as well. So it's not just a local copy and an up-to-date copy, it's also version tracked. And then from there, we have different ways to interact with that data. You can interact with it directly through its own API or JDBC driver, or again, out of the box, what we'll do is bring all that into our analytical platform Burst. And then so we'll on schedule bring that into our data warehouse, and then there's some prepackaged analytic content that comes with it, and then you can of course build to your heart's content that higher level analytics with the Burst product. And so that's a little bit on our data fabric strategy. And the cool thing is that it's not just the Infor data that you'll automatically capture in the data lake. You're also free to put any third-party data in there if you really just want to have that be the centralized place for all of your data in the cloud. All right. The other subject that I want to go over really quickly is the idea of workflows as well. It actually fits under the same umbrella because ION, our integration platform, also very nicely handles workflows. And so it's actually got kind of the same graphical front end as when we're designing integrations, but now instead we're designing business process flows. And so it's a drag and drop modeler. You can kind of preview it here on the right-hand side, where you can design all sorts of workflows. If we kind of go into that, break it down a little bit, you have different activities that will typically happen that you can drag on, whether it's a task that you're assigning to one of your users, or a notification that you're going to send out, or even an API that you want to call during the workflow, approval chains, wait statements, etc. These workflows can be very simple all the way to very complex. So there's different flows that we can diagram, like decision tables. We have a couple of them in here, loops that we may have, things that can run in parallel, etc. So I've seen customers design and create their own workflows that are very simple and straightforward, left to right, to very complex, and it's all over the place like a spider web kind of a detail. And there's some out-of-the-box workflows, right, that come with the SaaS environment as well. So you're not just starting from scratch. In terms of starting these workflows, it's pretty much wherever you want, right? Whether it's manually, your user clicks a button on a form, we can kick off the workflow, or if they're on their mobile device, there's a native mobile app. It could be automatic, right? So every time an update is made, that may be the trigger, and we'll send a bot over to ION, or we'll call an API, and we'll automatically kick off that workflow. Like I said, so it could be a customer-defined event that we use, or again, maybe a third-party application calls our API and kicks off one of these workflows. And last but not least, they can of course be scheduled. Often you'll have a scenario where you want to do something every day at midnight, and so we'll schedule that workflow. Interacting with workflows. So this is, how do my users interact with all of this? Well, it could be on our home pages. We have a widget for that, so you can kind of see everything. There's a centralized inbox that's built in. I'll show you that when we do the live part. We have a mobile application, so you can get that information pushed directly to your phone. Of course, we email everything out like we always do, the most common way to let people know. And then, we might not have any interaction with a workflow. Sometimes we are automating a process, and so we don't want a human to get involved except by exception. And then how we actually design these flows, and let me just go into one. Let me leave the PowerPoint. So here's an example of a customer order discount workflow where, let me do this real quick. So here I was able to design basically what happens when someone goes into my Sightline system and they update a customer order, giving it a discount bigger than I'm comfortable with. Henceforth, I wanted to go through an approval process. And so you can see this one's a little bit more than just your basic workflow, but I've got a task that I've assigned. Basically, this is going to go out to, in my case, it's going out to myself, but this would go out to the group or the managers group or whoever is designated to do that type of approval. And they get a little message and some content and a link back to, of course, the record that I'm talking about, sent to them either in their inbox or on their phone, or of course in their email inbox as well. And then based off of that decision, we actually call the APIs of Sightline and we make the update, right? If it was approved, we'll just call in the API and auto approve that and let it be. If it was rejected, then we'll roll back that change and we'll set it back to the old discount or revert it back to zero. And then at the end, right, we kind of send out the notification to let everyone know, hey, this was approved, right? Or hey, this wasn't approved, it was rejected. This is the steps you need to take, etc. And then, so what does that actually look like from the end user point of view? Well, let's look at the inbox, right? That's kind of one of the parts I talked about where most users will be able to come when they're already inside their system, right? They may be inside of Sightline like I was earlier, and they may want to quickly check their inbox. And this is all of your Infor generated tasks and alerts and notifications and everything else. And so here I could see an example of one of those workflows. This one's a slightly different one. This is a customer credit limit workflow. But I've got a drill back. I can go right back to the customer and look up more information. Let me do that just for demo purposes, right? It's going to take me right to that Sightline form, right to that customer. If I give it a second, right, and I'll be able to review all of that information. And there we go. So here's that customer that someone's trying to increase their credit limit. I've got the ability to quickly assign it to myself or assign it to someone inside of the group. I'll take ownership over it, and then I can easily approve or reject that new credit limit. So this is just one example, but this is what it could look like for the end user, right? And they might have some freedom where they can actually edit it before they send it back. They can upload attachments as part of this process or leave a note, and they can visually see where they are. This is a very simple workflow. It's just got 2 steps to it, and we're in that review step right here. And so that's one way that end users can interact with that, and that's what it actually looks like. The mobile app pretty much looks the exact same, but as you can imagine, refactored for your phone. And then, like I mentioned, we of course email things out as well. And that's really it for that last section. We've got roughly 6 minutes left, which is perfect because I'm about to wrap up with my last section, which only takes 2 minutes. So that's the second to last section, integrations and workflows. Mainly what we viewed here is our enterprise integration tooling, Infor ION. We talked a little bit about the data fabric and how that's really important. Capture all the information, one central repository. And then again, it mainly gets used in terms of reporting and analytics and also compliance and history, and because we're capturing every single change. It's effectively an audit log, but better at that point. Easy to use monitors for alerts, so we can, during that workflow designer that I was showing you earlier, we can easily set up triggers and alarms of when we want to be notified, all the way to full-on workflows, kind of like the latter examples that I showed there. So last but not least, because this is just an hour-long overview, I want to bring up this subject of Infor OS. Remember when we started here, I said what we're going to focus on are these first two sections. The cloud infrastructure, which we definitely did. We talked about AWS and kind of how that's laid out. But I also said we want to focus on this middle layer, and we'll kind of review different parts of it. So that middle layer, that technology platform, is Infor OS, right? It's a collection of different applications and services that is underneath the ERP, right? It's to augment and better it. And so kind of just scratching the surface, if you will, right? This isn't, I want to remind everyone that there's a lot more here as well. And this just comes all automatically with your subscription in a SaaS environment, right? This is just included. And so we did look at a couple things. We saw bits and parts of the enterprise portal. We talked about, how users log in, then there's single sign-on, and they're kind of just inside of the portal. I was inside my portal the entire time for this demo, right? I was using a home page with lots of links to slides, and I showed you the inbox, things like that. We didn't get to talk about it, but there is a full-on document management service, or I should say application, included with the cloud subscription, and so it's integrated into Sightline, and can be used also generally in terms of capturing any documents that you want and managing them and relating them and searching for them, of course. There is a full workflow and process automation tool, which we did look at for just a little bit. That's ION and its ability to design workflows and alerts, as well as the same umbrella. ION is also used for integrations and linking your systems together. We briefly talked about data fabric and why it's important and why we built it and why we heavily use it, obviously, on the analytical side of things. One thing we didn't talk about, mainly because this is the first thing that isn't automatically included, and that is we do have full-fledged machine learning add-on as well. So that's typically not a phase one when customers move to the cloud, but it is kind of a phase 5 in my mind. Is like once you're up and running for a couple years and you want to take it to the next level, machine learning kind of is that, right? That's where we actually start to do the really cool things in terms of problem solving and automation and of course predicting. But beyond that, we did talk about extensibility, at least briefly, and how we can extend in the cloud, a little bit of what that looks like, sort of how that applies to app development. And then, of course, we talked about security, at least at a high level, and how it's important that we, one, integrate to your identity provider, and then two, kind of have one set of security for all these different things that I'm glossing over here as well. And so, again, at a high level, that's my 2-minute recap, if you will, of there's a lot more to as well to kind of flesh out here if you're interested around not only being in the AWS cloud and running on that high availability model and all the nice things that come with that. There's also this whole technology platform that sits on top of that, independent of the ERP, independent of CloudSuite Industrial Sightline, that adds a lot of value. And so with that, we're at the end. So I'm going to say thanks, everybody, for your time today. I hope you got some good information out of this. Once more, my name is Marcelo Martins, and I'm always available too if there's any questions. Obviously, after the fact, apologies we didn't have time to answer them today. With that, I'm going to pass it back to the DRA team.
All right, thanks, Marcelo. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind all of our attendees that about 2 weeks from today, on Thursday, June 23rd, Infor will be hosting an advanced planning and scheduling session. You can view the full description and register for that session on decision.com/events. With that, I want to send a huge thank you to Marcelo for joining us today. Thank you to all of our attendees. We hope to see you at the next session.